The data petting zoo was started as a way of being able to proactively show people cool things that we can do with data that might not immediately occur to an analyst or to anyone. So with the goal of kind of like showing some interesting data resources that you might like to use in your analysis, that's really the motivation behind this presentation today. It also happens to be pending as part of a data brief, which I've attached the link in this opening slide. I've also shared this in the general Slack channel in case you want to look at the slides or click any links that we have provided. So the point of today's discussion, James and I and Jennifer have been working together to explore a question about what AI is. It's a pesky question. It was a question that is almost impossible to answer, and actually rightfully is impossible to answer in the most general form. And so what we're doing is we're taking a stab at it from a variety of different perspectives and showing why a definition matters to policymakers. We're focusing on the research part of AI. It's an emerging technology, which seems natural to why you would look at what's happening in the research literature. However, we want to acknowledge that there's other parts of artificial intelligence in terms of products, industry, in terms of other application areas, which are outside the scope of our conversation today. So we're not solving all problems. We're starting with a simple discussion of what is artificial intelligence in the AI space as it relates to scientific literature. So James and I will tag team this and we'll go through it. First of all, a few observations that I don't believe are highly contentious. Let me know if you think they are highly contentious. So over time, people have been trying to define AI, and there's been some major obstacles. First of all, meanings change over time. What was an expert system in 2009 is maybe not considered core to AI today. Deep learning was or neural network methods, may or may not have been included in some people's definitions, depending on how much work was going on it. So these meanings change. Also, peoples don't agree. People don't agree on what AI actually is. And this might come from a technical perspective. They might come from a policy experience. It might become just something that it was AI for a while and then drifted off and it didn't seem like AI anymore because it's so natural. And then there's many sub areas, which is another complication. So, knowledge reasoning, planning, machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, robotics, and all these different AGI are all different things that one could view as AI, and the methods and the tasks and the things that are being explored are actually very different. This work by Kraft and others is really amusing in the sense that is Roomba an AI system? It turns out there's some disagreement among researchers. Some people say, oh, clearly it is. Others say it's not. And so this perspective just helps us realize the confusion that is often the case as it comes to AI. And then the question about AI-based binoculars. Apparently, most people think binoculars are not artificial intelligence is not part of robotics. However, some people do a little bit. And if you look for products, you can actually find some binoculars that have AI inside. I'm not exactly sure how, but I haven't looked into it far enough. But so it's a changing space. So in a couple of years, we might all say, of course, everyone thinks binoculars have AI in it, because in 5 years, maybe all of them will. Just a quick sound check. Am I coming through stably with my voice? Okay, great. So what we've done is we've looked at all this work, we've done a lot of analysis, and we've started to say, well, what are the basic principles of what an AI definition should include? And we have three principles we propose in the data product that we linked earlier to, and I'm going to talk about them briefly here. First of all, it needs to, any AI definition, particularly as it relates to AI, in research space and development space, should capture distributed judgments of dynamically and continually. It needs to be stable over time, and it needs to sample a large enough expert crowd so you get a good representation of what's happening. Secondly, it should be composed of meaningful subareas, as opposed to trying to, say this is the AI definition. We need to recognize it's made up of many different areas, and go ahead and include those areas explicitly in the definition. The third one is it should be formed by examples rather than just prose. In the government, I've spent many person years in committees trying to define something. And it's the most frustrating thing, because you get these grenade throwers in meetings, and you're like, we're almost to a point of action. They're like, well, I'm not sure what this word means. And we just, and in the government, that can cause a spiral into trying to figure, what we actually do need to define this, and rightfully so sometimes, but also sometimes frustratingly. But we often end with these beautifully crafted prose definitions that feel, after working on them, are meaningful, but unless they're connected with real examples of what's happening, they either get out of irrelevant quickly, or never actually connect with the real world. So the proposed approach that we're taking is, and this is the data product that we're creating for CSET, is to use Archive. So Archive has, tens of thousands of AI relevant articles that are tagged both by the author as being, relevant to an area, and then there's a editor, or I forget, is that what they call them, James? Is it editor or?
Yeah, editors, and they also have moderators.
Okay, so editors and moderators who also validate that tagging. Yes, this article is indeed related to computer vision. Yes, this article is indeed related to robotics or natural language or computation and language, NLP, or it is related to an area. So essentially we get a two-level human annotation that basically says that this area is indeed related to artificial intelligence, or to the field. What we've done is we've defined artificial intelligence as those subject categories that seem relevant to us to be related to AI. So this we include AI, computer vision, computation language, machine learning, multi-agent learning, and robotics. I believe this definition was actually recommended by Archive moderators as a way of viewing AI. We're not actually pretending that we've got this definition nailed down, or that we're perfect or we're accurate. This is a pragmatic definition that seemed reasonable to us, and we basically then trained this language model off of these annotations of the articles in this subject category, and we then ran it over Microsoft Academic, Web of Science, Dimensions, and using this classification information, we were able to define AI that in a way that met these three principles. It was distributed human judgment, the definition was composed of meaningful subareas, and it had direct examples to what was and was not relevant to AI. Using this then, this is a way that's commonly used to score systems called the F1 measure. It's a harmonic mean of precision recall of like what's tagged and not. I've got a little graphic if you want to get into what that means. But suffice to say right now that it's a rough measure of how accurate the system is in classifying the articles in this 30 or 40 million article set between 2010 and 2020. As AI related. So what's really interesting here is we take, this is the Cyber model, this is the blue line, that allows us to show how well we perform as a function of time. So we take each year and build essentially a system that can work for each of those years. And then we're able to show that the system performs essentially 20 points better. James, I'll hand it over to you to go into a little bit more detail on this.
Yeah. So the three methods that we're comparing here are the Cybert model that tries to identify papers that are like any of those 6 subjects that Dewey mentioned in the previous slide, against the Elsevier model that they developed for their 2018 AI report, and is also used by the folks at Stanford for the AI index to identify AI relevant papers. And then finally, we developed in the spring of last year a set of keywords, a simple keyword query that searched for words we thought likely to surface relevant papers. And that's the red dashed line.
So what's interesting about those keyword-based ones, and we've noticed this for years, so you spend a month or a week or however much time you have developing this Magnus opium, not opium, wow, I can't even speak in Latin. I will stay away from Latin. That was kind of funny. This beautiful keyword definition. And what happens is your knowledge of artificial intelligence, for example, is, you're using today's understanding and you build a set and you feel like this really represents. However, if you were to run that query that you created for 10 years ago, you're going to find it's actually much poorer performing because you created it with today's understanding. And if you then hold that definition and then you roll it forward 10 years or a few years, you're going to see the performance drop off because the world is changing in emerging technologies. So what we're trying to do is get rid of that human curation requirement and basically use the automatically generated human curation from archive so that it can stay up to date automatically. So any questions up to this point about this part of the definition?
I have a quick question, Dewey. This goes back to the previous slide about, could you throw a little more light on how you defined, like, how do you talk about your sub areas? As in, like, how do you relate that? I mean, there's certain sub areas that are, in some sense, kind of like have this, have a tendency to not be seen as sub areas, but a field in itself. For example, like autonomy or robotics. I don't know, like, did you go for an all-encompassing approach? And like, if you could give some examples of like the sub areas that you include under AI.
James, you want to take that or want me to?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a taxonomy of papers on archive, and as Dewey said, authors select from that taxonomy when they're picking when they're uploading their papers. And in computer science, there are 39 areas. In a later slide, there's a link in the notes to that taxonomy, so you can see which 6 we picked and how they're defined out of the 39. So there's no autonomy field as defined, for archive, but there is a robotics field. I think taking a look at the choices we made might be the easiest thing to do.
And James, could you clarify? I think it's true that a paper can be tagged as more than one of these categories. Is that true? Yeah,
that's right. And we found actually that because of cross-posting, it doesn't make some of the choices that we felt were borderline don't make a lot of difference. So there's a subject called neural and evolutionary computing, of which some papers are relevant. There's some neural architecture stuff in there, but it turns out that all of those papers are also cross-posted to machine learning, which we do include. So we capture those as well.
Cool, makes sense.
So just to be very concrete, we're using these 6 codes to define AI in this version, Hussam. Only those 6. And recognize that we're picking up cross-posted articles. Great, so let's talk a little bit about why this might matter to policymakers. It's academically pleasing and people can argue about how many papers, are on the head of a pin or whatever. But ultimately, the only reason that we're engaged here at CSET on this question is because we care about policy making, and that's really where we're going to talk for the rest, for the next few slides. So first of all, I want to say these AI definitions. So this is the cyber definition. This is the keyword definition, which follows the standard way of defining a set of literature when people are doing policy analysis or horizon scanning or looking at a corpus of literature related to something. They usually use a set of keywords. And then here's the Elsevier hybrid model. The Elsevier model was a slight advance in methodology. I don't think it performed as well as they had hoped, but it was a nice way forward. What they did is they created a whole bunch of keywords, and then they built a random forest classifier to help augment the assigning of articles as AI relevant, not AI relevant, trained off some of the corpuses, and it essentially enhanced the keywords a little bit. But what's interesting is, and the Elsevier hybrid model was what was used by the 2019 AI Index report. So this is actually a published report that uses this method, and it shows that keywords, Elsevier hybrid, and the CSET Cybert only actually overlaps for 18.8% of the articles. That's actually a fairly small percentage of overlap, which is a little disturbing, and it continues, basically there's continuing areas of disturbance. So here's now, we're using so I don't know if everyone knows, but CSET now has Microsoft Academic as part of our stream of content. And through Jennifer's work, we've linked all the articles that are in Microsoft Academic to the same article in Web of Science, to the same article in Dimensions. So we have this now master set of literature that includes all three of these sources. Archive is in here also, and we basically can show the overlap. It turns out that Microsoft Academic, as one would expect from a crawler, has the largest share of the content. It also has some interesting rubbish in there, just to be aware. And then Dimensions has a fairly good overlap, but there is content out here that is Web of Science and Dimensions covers that are unique. And it turns out, well, I'll get to that in just a second. I see a question from Rita. Did you want to talk about that?
I didn't want to interrupt, so I just wrote it.
So there is variation. I think, James, you looked briefly at this temporal variation of overlap of the coverage, and I think there was nothing shocking about it, as I recall, that would seem to indicate that 2019 was way different than 2007 or 2011. Sorry, it was 2010, 2019. Is that right, James?
Yeah, that's right. Although we do think that MAG's coverage is improving over time.
Yeah, MAG is getting, truly. They put a lot of resources into it. And we feel like, I'll get out to the end, I'll get to the point, but these three resources together actually provide a more stable definition of AI as a data source. Okay, so that's just a few base points. And then also, it's really interesting to note that MAG, so to be able to, the kind of policy story that we're going to tell, and I should have probably said this first, is we're using a very simple, embarrassingly simple model of competition. So, and our competition is based on production of, quality adjusted production of top 1% of articles by China, by US, and by the European Union. Basically, we're looking at the percent share of the worldwide 1% literature by these three regions. And this requires us to figure out what the 1% is, and it requires us to identify who authored the paper and what country they came from. So it's really important for the citation counts to be accurately measured. And it turns out that Microsoft Academic has way more citations. So in the top 5% of articles, the most highly top 5% cited of articles, MAG has twice as many citations than Dimensions and 4 times as many citations as Web of Science. So the citation counts are higher in Microsoft Academic. However, if you look at this table, you can see for 35.7% of the articles, Dimensions has more citations. And for 19.7%, Web of Science has more citations. So once again, by using a combined set of literature, we're getting more coverage. We're also getting a higher coverage of the citations. And so it allows us to then get a top 1% that is a little different than what you would have gotten if you just used one of these sources, which actually impacts the results quite a lot. So let me get to the policy relevant question. So in the panel here, you see 4 graphs. The top left one, the x-axis is the year of publication, and the y-axis is the percent share of worldwide production of the top 1% of papers. So you can see here back in 2010, about 35% of the top AI papers were from the US and about 7-ish% was from China. And then you roll forward and you say, oh, look, interesting, in 2015, China started producing more of the top 1% of papers than the European Union did. And then you roll forward, and then in about 2018, China passes the US. So it's now producing the majority of the top 1%. And top 1%, just to be clear, is by citation. How many people are citing your work from outside your paper? But so this is, an often way people look at how things are going in AI. But going back to the principles we talked about, we need to decompose. AI is not a monolithic area. We have to look at different sub areas. So let's look at computer vision, robotics, and natural language processing. Same X and Y scale. And we see, oh, isn't this for computer vision? You see China actually crossing earlier by at least a year, and crossing the US at least by a year earlier, and doing so in a little bit more dramatic fashion than in all of AI. So you see China's engagement in computer vision is disproportionate compared to all of AI, and it's actually we'll see it's actually a dominant factor in some of these in this curve for all AI. Let's look at number C here, or letter C, and this is for robotics literature, and we see this progression has been slower. It was kind of flat through 14, and it started to pick up for China, and it started to cross the European Union sometime between, well, it technically crossed in 17, but kind of laid even until 19, where it really started to separate itself from the European Union production. And then you can see what's happening with the US. China has not as typically focused on robotics based on this analysis in terms of their emphasis. And then here's natural language processing. And you see here, the US has had a dominant share. It was starting to dip down, and if you had projected out, you might have seen a much tighter slope. But interesting things happened in 2019 in natural language processing, which really woke up a lot of usage in the US. This is where transformer-based models started to come out, and the US picked up a tremendous amount of interest, and is now share-wise in the most cited literature is really picking up a large share. And China looks like it is crossing European Union in 2019, but barely. Anyway, the point here is, to repeat myself, is if you had just tried to make a policy using this very simple analysis, which I would never advise, but if you wanted to think about national competition based on this view, you would actually totally lose the nuance of what's happening in natural language processing or other sub areas. If you looked here, you wouldn't also not realize that China has a really significant amount of work going on in computer vision. This link here is to a work that was done by the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, which projected an intersection to happen in the top 1% in 2025. Now that's 7 years different than the forecast that we have, or the observation that we have. And it turns out the methods choices, they had some data quality assumptions. They used some very simple heuristics for what meant for China, what was a China author versus a US versus a European Union. Oh, I think they just did China and the US. So we basically reproduced their work. We showed we could reproduce it. And then we started improving their work and found that that 2025 estimate actually rolls back closer to 2018 when you start using our definition. So anyway, this is a simple model. I'm just emphasizing once again, it's one dimension, but it helps you realize why, if you choose different definitions and you're not careful about your methods, you can get wildly different results. And that's really what we're trying to institute here. So that's my first part. I'm going to hand this over to James. I see some questions in the Slack, in messages. How do you combine different citation counts? What we do is we take the max. We tried min, we tried other things, but the max seems to be it works, and it provides a way of combining it. we're not claiming it's the best. And then the next question, could the NLP result be driven by Chinese authorship publishing relatively more NLP papers in Chinese as opposed to English? So we're dealing with the top 1%. So realize, first of all, to get highly cited at this level, you generally need to be accessible to the world, which generally requires you to publish in English. So it's unlikely that Chinese articles would break into this 1%. That's not to say great work isn't happening in Chinese. And that's actually analysis that, based on Daniel's recent work, we'll actually be able to measure this, and we'll be able to look at what's indigenously happening in China in Chinese. So stay tuned on that one. That's a really important question.
Dewey, can I ask also a question about the citations before you answer, Igor?
Yeah.
And this is probably just my ignorance about scientific literature, but when I think about the articles in political science, for instance, that get cited the most, it's often because people publish a data set that others can use, or because it's some sort of a very comprehensive literature review, and then everybody can cite from it. And also something that happens is you get these clusters of people that are working in a very similar field, and they start citing each other like crazy. And then those articles and those like research agendas kind of rise to the top and go into the 1%. Do something similar like that happen in science as well? Like, or is it just because it's exquisite work and that's the only way that they make it into the 1% citations?
No, it's a really great question. Thank you for raising it, Rita. So this is why I say this is a very simple model.
Okay.
I would never want someone in policy to make policy off that single picture, and that would be embarrassing and make me ill.
But that does happen often, right? Like the top most cited papers gets mentioned a lot as a metric of importance.
Yeah. It's an appropriate one because, looking at computer science, I don't have these numbers in front of me, but, yes, review articles are more disproportionately cited. Yes, people in cliquey communities that are loved by their peers get cited more. There's also a rich gets richer effect. So if you've been cited a little bit more than your peers, you're going to get more citations over time because people are lazy and they'll just cite your work because it's the stuff that they read being cited all the time. Mm-hmm. So there's all those factors that are live, and then there's clubbing effects where actually there's a paper that was published by Georgia Tech, that showed that it looks like there's actually national policy of certain countries, maybe China, like to strongly encourage people to cite articles as a matter of policy, which could screw stuff up too. So clearly not the end-all be-all measure. You would want to tear this apart further before you actually say, you should make policy off this.
Okay.
Dewey?
Yep.
Hey, it's Lynn. There may be room in the paper then for a line about that, maybe a footnote or endnote.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. You're welcome to suggest for all the people here that link at the beginning as it's out for reviewers in that form. You're welcome to make suggestions and thoughts. I think that's a really great idea.
Okay, and by the way, kudos on the style. We talked about this yesterday, but it looks very much like the CSET style, and thank you for your efforts to make it conform.
Oh, you're welcome. Igor had a question that I'm going to have James mention, and then he can take over the presentation. That last question, James, you want to answer that?
Sure. Yeah. So, Igor, we were following in the vein of this AI2 analysis that compared country output between China and the US, and they found that only 5% of the papers in their data set was the result of a collaboration between US and Chinese authors. We found something pretty similar in our data. So what we did here for the previous slide is we just looked for a paper that had at least one US author, for example, and no Chinese author, and no EU author. Those were our three categories. And if so, that was a US paper. And then if it was a Chinese author, the same, at least one Chinese affiliation, no US or EU affiliation. And that's how we produced the country output shares. Does that make sense?
So we threw away the 5%? Is that right, James? James? Am I hearable?
I think his connection broke up. It was getting pretty unstable.
Yeah,
but,
my connection is
there.
seems to be cutting in and out. Igor, were you about to ask a follow-up?
no, I was just going to say, Roger, thanks. Makes sense.
Okay.
Great.
Actually, James, do you mind if I just pile on? This is Melissa.
Yeah, please.
Igor, one of the things that this kind of statistic or this data point suggested to me is that it really does matter that we try to do one of these manual annotations around a couple of the clusters of folks and dig into individual nationalities, because there's this belief that there's all this collaboration, but it doesn't show up when you just look at collaboration through the lens of the nationality of the institution. And so there's two stories here, right? Where the collaboration between the US and China is not nearly as high institution to institution. It's more that we hire a lot of foreign nationals inside our institutions, and we do a lot, and we work in very diverse groups. And I think that the reality of the story is actually different than what people believe it is.
Yeah, actually, what James was saying was really making me think along those lines, right? The fraction of papers that are truly joint authors across nations seems much smaller than I thought. But anyways, that's a whole sidebar we should pursue or discuss further, because that would be an interesting piece of research too. All right.
Yeah, I definitely want to
out here.
pull that thread another time, yeah.
Dewey, could you go forward one slide?
Yep.
Yeah, so I'll show some more results and some code in a moment, but I wanted to add a few comments about how we thought of the problem. The general problem that we're facing here is how to delineate a field of emerging research. What kind of papers are in, what kind of papers are out. We've talked a lot, like in CSET hallways, about the problem of defining AI. And I think Mugtaf and Kahane here in this pull quote put it well. This is a bibliometrics piece from 2007, but at that time they were describing not AI, but nanotech. And in the prior decade, some of their colleagues had tackled a similar problem with biotech. And this work in bibliometrics led to good principled methods for developing queries, for measuring the growth, the emergence of topics and fields. But the takeaway here is that this definitional challenge that we're facing with identifying AI research and applications of AI isn't a new one. It's a feature of emerging fields. And so there's some methods that we can borrow from bibliometrics to solve this problem. Dewey mentioned the Elsevier report earlier, and the AI index that relies on it. So they took one of these bibliometric approaches and culled books and patents, textbooks, syllabi, everything they could find for these candidate search terms, which they intended to use to surface articles that were relevant to delineate this field of AI research. And I think this was a well-defined effort, but in the technical appendix, you can kind of sniff out a bit of frustration with the final result. You know, they said that these outside experts that they'd asked to score all of these terms couldn't reach any agreement. There was no set of keywords that they could put in front of experts that was broad enough to cover the field and also specific enough to identify what was AI relevant. So what we're doing here is, Dewey, if you could go one more, rather than asking subject matter experts whether terms or papers were related to AI, which I think is a really hard question, we wanted to ask them whether papers are in better defined areas of research, like computer vision or natural language processing. And also asking subject matter experts to label tens of thousands or 100,000 of these papers would be really resource intensive. So we wanted to take advantage of this pre-labeled data in the form of archive submissions. So a few more details now on these archive categories. We focused on the period 2010 through 2019. And the table here gives counts of these papers in 6 of the 39 subject categories on archive in computer science that we thought were particularly interesting. And for a particular research question, for a particular analytic product, we could focus on maybe just one of these, or maybe just 2, or we could look at one of the other 39 subjects entirely. What we think is appealing about this subject-specific approach, we have a model for each of these subjects individually. What we think is appealing is that it's customizable to, it can be scoped appropriately to the research question, to the analytic question. So we have a large number of examples in each of the categories, and the approach is to learn from these examples what constitutes an NLP paper or a CV paper as defined by the archive authors and moderators, in effect asking these experts what papers are which. And then we apply what we learn elsewhere. So the results on the next slide, we basically find that the task or the application-specific subjects are easier to learn than the catch-all machine learning field. So the numbers for NLP, CV, and robotics are higher than the more diffuse field of machine learning, which also gets a lot of cross posts. But we are able to outperform the keywords that we developed last year substantially, and also the approach that the Elsevier folks designed and applied to the AI index. So I think we have one more slide. What I wanted to leave here is a couple example queries. We have for mode users new tables that include the results of these subject predictions, these subject model predictions, and also of the predictions from alternative models for the linked data set, our corpus of all the scientific literature from 2010 onward, deduplicated from Microsoft Academic Graph, from Dimensions, and from Web of Science. And so the first query here, since this is a data petting zoo, we have some SQL. This is a comparison of counts of predictions from alternative methods, from the CSET keyword solution, the Elsevier solution, and then the subject models and the all subject model. And then on the lower left, we have the number of articles associated with institutions in each country in our analysis. This is similar to one of the queries that we wrote for the data brief. This gives the number in each here from China, the US, the EU, and then combinations of those 3 or other. And then finally, this is the query on the right-hand side that is behind the figure earlier in the presentation that shows the overlap among the data sets. So I think at this point, we should just open it up for questions or discussion.
One question I have is, should we be thinking of this as, so clearly this is a great tool that we can now use for any work that we do with the scientific literature data we have. Is that right? Because we can like apply
Right.
a classifier and like say, if we want to say like, use AI publications in some way, we now have a really nice way of like pulling out those AI publications. That's awesome. I'm curious if you think there are, or maybe do we, like, if this is more widely applicable, or is like, we've had sort of conversations with DHS about defining AI, and I think you felt like this has relevance there. I guess I feel a little bit less confident in how this like applies outside the scientific literature context. Does that question make sense? I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
It
Dewey,
does,
you had
and
a slide here.
yeah, I'm just, the next slide is exactly what was intended to answer that question. So I'm really excited that you asked that, Helen. So we believe that those principles are obviously harder to implement in some places when there's not a lot of human annotation. But in areas where there is, for example, patents. Patents are filed with classification codes that are agreed upon essentially by the filer as well as the patent reviewer. So once again, you get a two-step review process. And we're following a very similar principle on patents. For AI companies, it's very hard to determine what AI companies are because there's so many different ways of looking at it. But the little snapshot here basically attempts to identify 5 examples of categories, which are judged, some of them by crowds, some of them by data. And together we kind of use that to infer what is an AI company. So we're basically taking these same principles and trying to apply them higher up the food chain in terms of applications. So just so you're not disoriented by this, this is AI companies. This is whether or not they appear on an expert list, you know, Forbes or some other experts saying this is an AI heavy company. Whether or not they're eating up a large percentage of the top AI talent from the top 20 AI PhD degree granting institutions. So here you can see Google has a huge share of it. Ford Motor Company hired 5 of these people, which is actually a coup because those people are hard to hire. There's not a lot of them. And so you see areas where others, and then how many public references so if you look at all the comments on you know, news articles, white papers, press releases, pages on the internet in general, how many of the total amount of them use that company's name and AI relevant terms. And we find that, for example, Google has 50,000, you know, Microsoft Research has about 1,000, and then what percentage of the total number of references are actually AI related. So Google has 34%. So all references to Google, only 35%. And then this is the patents. Anyway, I don't mean to grab into the weeds here, but the point is, Helen, we're trying to take these principles and apply them more broadly. And we'll be looking into the industrial sector's applications and practical, you know, other AI definitions for policymakers. You were actually on one of the calls where we're trying to talk through some of these issues with some government folk. Anyway, sorry for the long-winded answer, but very exciting.
That's really interesting and really helpful. This could just 100% be my short-term memory issues. You talked a few times about sort of these principles. Do you mean just sort of the underlying principles of this discussion, or was there, did I forget a slide that had sort of the key principles? Okay, great. Yeah, great.
That they're basically coming back from human judgments, and we try to get a large crowd as opposed to 2 people who you like or who will like you. They need to be composed of meaningful sub-areas. We can't just try to do a broad AI definition, and they need to be linked to examples as opposed of what's really happening today, as opposed to just arbitrary fancy prose.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.